What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build this wooden snare drum. Stay tuned. This wooden snare drum is modeled after a cajon, a traditional Latin percussion instrument. I used 3/4 inch plywood for the sides, 1/4 inch plywood for the bottom, and 1/8 inch plywood for the top. This was a really simple project and is a great use for those small leftover scrap pieces you have hanging around. You can see the octagonal design here. I designed this to fit in standard snare drum stands with a width of 12 inches. I started by building the sides of the snare. I used 5.5 inch wide strips of 3/4 inch plywood here. I wanted a snare drum with a diameter of roughly 12 inches, give or take, so I cut my 8 segments at 4 3/4 of an inch long. To cut the segments, I set my blade angle on the table saw to 22.5 degrees and used my miter gauge with a stop block to make the cuts. If you don't have a table saw, you could certainly cut the segments on a miter saw as well. Once the segments were cut, I put them together to make sure they lined up. After checking the fit, I cut biscuit slots into the pieces to help them with alignment during assembly. The biscuits also gave the snare some additional strength. I also cut a port into one of the side pieces using a 2.5 inch Forstner bit. I did this at the drill press, but you could certainly use a handheld drill here. Next, I assembled the sides using biscuits and glue. The pieces came together great with a tight glue line on all sides. I used one of these strap clamps, which was perfect for this type of glue up. After the glue dried, I cut the top and bottom pieces. I cut these on the bandsaw, but you could just as easily use a jigsaw. I didn't even really need to cut the octagonal shape, it just helps to reduce the wear on the flush trim bit I use in the next step. I glued on the bottom as it doesn't need to be removable and added 1-inch screws. I also added clamps to make sure the glue had even pressure. After the glue dried, I used a flush trim bit on my router to flush up the edges. The top is made using the same process, except I didn't add glue. This is so that I can adjust the snare in case I need to later. Once the snare structure was done, I got to work on creating a mounting bracket for the snare wire. Also, I'll have a link in the video description to the exact snare wire I used. So first, I cut the snare wire in half. Next, I mounted both halves of the snare to a piece of scrap 2x4 that I cut in half at the bandsaw. Really, any piece of smaller scrap wood will work here. I screwed both halves of the snare wire to the piece of scrap wood and then attached the snare assembly to the inside of the snare walls using a few screws from the outside. This allows me to adjust the angle of the snare wire to really dial in the sound. At this point, I realized that the 1/4 inch plywood was too thick to produce a good sound, and I remade the top using 1/8 inch plywood off camera, and it sounded much better. I sanded down the entire drum using 120 grit sandpaper and then rounded over all the edges using an 1/8 inch radius roundover bit on my router. I finished sanding with 180 grit and then vacuumed any dust from the surface. For the finish, I used 2 coats of spray shellac, sanded with 320 grit sandpaper after it dried, and then put 2 coats of spray polyurethane on top of the shellac. Once that dried, the snare was finished. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a lot of fun. This would make a great gift for any kids who are into music, maybe want to start trying to play the drums, but you don't want to invest in a full drum set. This is a great way to get started. You can play it with your hands. You can also get rubber mallets if you want a different sound, and they're really cheap to build. I built this with pretty much only scrap. I did have to buy a sheet of the 1/8 inch plywood. That was $8 for a sheet that was big enough to probably cut 4 of these tops out of. So again, you could make a handful of these for 40, 50 bucks. If you guys want to see more DIY musical instruments, I did a 4-part video series on building a guitar from scratch, so definitely go check that out. Also, if you don't already, get subscribed. I have new projects every Tuesday. I also have a second channel where I do weekly maker roundups and tool reviews. Get subscribed there as well. And last, if you want to support me, use some of the affiliate links in the video description below. That really helps keep these projects coming. All right, thanks again for watching, guys, and until next time, happy building.